Salam Joldas, you are on the Red Yurt channel. Although the world is shocked now by military actions in Ukraine, we propose to return to the topic of coronavirus. I have a wonderful friend. She grew up in South Korea, received her PhD in lab medicine and pathobiology, and works for charity in the US. The very fact that a person for the field of healthcare has become a Marxist is surprising to me because their salaries are way too big for me. So I invited her to talk to her about the inequality in the field of medicine. Let's start. Hello, honey. I'm
Hello.
happy to see you here. We wanted to talk to you since you're expert in medical studies in the US. You have PhD degree.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for taking an interest in my research and my thoughts. I consider myself an experienced researcher in health and health equity. I don't know if I could call myself an expert in healthcare in the US. And I've certainly been drawn to some of the Marxian framework around class analysis. And those are the aspects that I would look forward to talking to you about. But what was interesting though was just growing up in Korea, I think I always was very sensitive to this question of power and how power operates, just because of the fact that South Korea is one of those many countries around the world whose fate was largely dictated by more powerful countries near it.
Yes.
So throughout the Korean history, it was, learning about the Korean history when I was in high school was so much about memorizing who invaded us when, and how long did the war lasted, and how that changed the subsequent trajectory. So anyways, I think, it doesn't matter exactly whose work I gravitated towards. I think I was really asking myself a lot of questions around what makes power concentrated, and that led me to reading outside my field of training, and that got me interested in the materialist lens of looking at the history of the human history. So in other words, how relations of power are really rooted in the relations of resources, something concrete. Power is not something like mysterious that falls from the sky. It's really rooted in what people need concretely to live and survive and flourish. So that's how my thoughts gradually sort of evolved from power and how power relates to material conditions, and how the material conditions between individuals and between nations have shaped the human development
Yep.
at a very communal level within the relation of individuals, but also in the international level. So,
But how did you come to all this? Through massive anti-communist propaganda in South Korea, in Canada, in the US? Like, you watch movies, you listen, you're like, how did you develop this independence of thought?
that's a great question, and for that I do have to thank many individuals that I have encountered, including my own parents. I think I've always been fortunate enough to kind of value the ability to think critically and independently.
Yep.
And you are right. I think, especially at the time that when I was growing up in South Korea, the force of anti-communist propaganda, I could imagine now, it was probably like formidable, because I remember years after my family arrived in Canada, just through some volunteer work, I was talking to a Korean Canadian lady who had been volunteering with another Canadian organization to visit North Korea to do some collaborative work at the civil society level. And she showed me a picture of a subway in Pyongyang. And I remember looking at that photo and being shocked to see how much more advanced the underground system was when the photo was taken. I can't remember when, compared to all the perceptions that I was raised with in South Korea.
Okay.
So just with that, I could imagine like the thoroughness of the anti-communist propaganda and how that shaped my entire elementary school and education, the high school education in South Korea. So you are right. It seems almost like a minor miracle or an extreme privilege and fortune that I have
I don't think
been.
So. we're materialists, we're Marxists. We should be explaining everything depending on how it happens. What on the circumstances why it happens. The circumstances told you that you should be thinking about it.
That's
the
right.
Life was not giving you answers to simple questions that you had.
That's right. So I think being trained as a very basic scientist, I mean, I think I can imagine now. I never realized it then as a young graduate student that I'm going to learn to think really critically, and as a result this will open up doors. But
that's why universities are full of Marxists. I can talk to every second American historian, and he's in some way he likes Marxism, or he says there is some truth in it, like this method was right at least. And there are some even very hardcore communists among professorship,
there are some. There are some. I wonder though how much of that is changing in academia. Again, I count myself very fortunate to have met mentors in my graduate training who have really encouraged me to think critically, not necessarily to push me into some set of doctrines, whether it's Marxian or whoever's, but I really appreciate now that regardless of their own personal beliefs, just that rigor of asking some fundamental questions and being able to formulate some hypotheses around potential answers and just try and approach those questions no matter what others might tell you as potential answers. So that's, I think, in a sort of long-winded way, that's how I've become drawn to the socialist ideas. It was never a deliberate intent to say, I want to be, I find your Marxian theories really cool and I want to learn about this like all the other. It was almost like I really want to understand why power tends to get concentrated. And as I was switching my focus in my own area of training towards health research and health equity specifically, that became even more pronounced. Because as you can imagine, there are many ways to look at the question of health inequity. We could just purely look at the level of biology.
We'll come back to it probably.
So I think as I become, so on one hand there's this questions around power that were probably planted in me even since my childhood, growing up in South Korea. And I think there's another aspect that drew me to science just for the rigor of wanting to understand what you observe in a systematic fashion. And I think in some unexpected way, I think just by asking a series of questions around power and material conditions and inequities, that drew me to Marxian theories. I would still feel more comfortable considering myself as somebody who finds Marxian analysis very compelling rather than Marxist, but we can argue about that some other time.
It's like a lot of people I talk to who are very sympathetic to socialistic ideas. they say I'm like, oh, you're communist, you're talking, speaking like communist, you're providing all these ideas as communist, so you're communist. And he's like, no, a communist is too high rank, you know, for me. I'm not good enough to be a communist, you know. So you're the same, like you're like, I use Marxist analysis, but I'm not Marxist.
For me, I think the discomfort, the source of discomfort, if I even like experimentally consider myself Marxist, is because I feel very passionately against cult of personality. And maybe just the word of Marxist, it kind of,
it's a stereotype.
To me,
it's a stereotype. We should be pushing it out, you know, like I
think so.
Yeah. It's talking about cult of personality. When where we're here right now, we are in Washington State. There is a Washington Lake. The capital is a Washington. The founder of this country, a lot of things were named, and there is a cult of personality of George Washington, and it's normal for every system, or maybe it won't be normal for future socialism.
Yeah.
Talking about cult of personality, I think the most liked comment under this video will be, and it's like some joke when you speak to any anti-communists. They're like, if you like communism, why don't you go to North Korea? And how you would answer this question when person will be asking you, like, if you like Marxism, if you think Marxian analysis is good, why don't you live in North Korea, honey?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Well, because I think the way I would answer that question is, to me, that question is flawed in some fundamental way, because just the inherent, the logic assumed in that question is, if somebody finds Marxian analyses compelling, then therefore he or she must agree with the system in DPRK.
Yep.
I mean, for me, that logic is flawed in a number of ways.
Yep.
Because to find a set of ideas, whether it's Marxian class analysis or historical materialism, to find those ideas compelling, that is not to say that therefore I wholeheartedly embrace this, another system that operates on a like a distinct political structure.
So I worked in your apartment and I have seen a lot of interesting things, like a good literature, but what is this? This is like a...
Yes, this is my
I
latest.
like the art when it's has meaning. What is the meaning of this?
There's no meaning, but I love it. I can tell you what got me to do it. So I had this beautiful bundle of roses in a vase, like a lot of people would just keep roses. And I was getting a little bit sad as they were slowly wilting, and I didn't want them to just go away because they look so beautiful. So I was thinking, how can I actually keep them a little bit longer? And easiest thing would be just to hang them upside down somewhere, just exactly as they were, right? With green leaves and everything. And then as I was drying them, I began to see them in a, I don't know why, in this very structured, this is very artificial structured arrangement, right?
Yeah.
Very different from how natural roses look. And for some reason, that thought kind of entered my head. Out of curiosity, I thought, oh, I wonder what it would look. Almost like having tiny rose light bulbs. So, once I enjoyed them in this very natural form with green leaves, and here they're almost like mathematically arranged. I actually measured the distance to evenly place them. They're not random.
Okay.
And now that they've lost all the green leaves, I suddenly began to see the actual flowers slightly differently. They almost look like tiny light bulbs, don't you think so?
Yeah.
So even though there's no meaning behind it, I loved how appreciating them in their natural form for a while, and then now I see them in kind of different,
opposite to natural form.
yeah, in a different way. But what is still completely natural is you see how the stems naturally bend in completely different way, right?
Yeah.
Every one of them.
Just like Marxist analysis does.
I don't know about that, but that was my latest fun play that I did.
Since you are sympathetic to Marxist theory and you are South Korean, I have to ask you, what do you think generally about North Korea? How do you consider it? There is a lot of myths about it, or it's truly a totalitarian, ruthless state?
I have to admit, I've never visited North Korea or have worked with any organization or individual that is very familiar with it. So this is purely my opinion based on what's publicly available. And I do believe that a lot of the myths about North Korea, in my view, are extremely biased and I would say ideologically driven against it. For example, I know, at least with my research in health field, one of the common myths is that the North Korean government just simply doesn't care about its people at all.
Yep.
You just imagine these massive number of people just suffering miserably and dying, and the government just doesn't care at all. Even though I've never visited North Korea to counter that argument directly, at least from a lot of papers that I've come across, published by organizations that have worked directly in DPRK with DPRK agencies, that the immunization coverage is high, that the government actually does care a lot about population health. They have a fairly robust public health system.
Yep.
But of course, what we have to understand is they've been experiencing extreme scarcity of resources.
Yes.
Largely because of sanctions. So I think we have to be careful when we
Criticize?
That's right, come up with this easy myth that the poor conditions, or whether it's health conditions or living conditions, are entirely because of the political system that we have. Certainly, from what I can, from the information that I've access to, it's certainly not a democratic republic. I could surmise that much. Exactly how much of the suffering is because of the political system, and how much of it is compounded by just the fact that there's this one political system that wants to chart its own way in the ocean of this much more dominant capitalist system. So I think we just have to be careful whenever we are fed with these easy myths about DPRK, about the broader political context that it's operating.
But there is one thing to criticize for sure North Korea. It's because their inheritance of power, there is a grandfather, there is a father,
That's
now
right.
there is a son, and it looks so odd, especially for socialism, It looks weird. And do you think it is because there is some Asian influence, feudalistic influence, when socialism have fallen in Central Asian countries, all of them had presidents, dictators, they came to power for 30 years, for 40 years. Their children have become very prestigious people in these countries, they have become singers, like stars, that was very fun, and the same happened in North Korea, this influence of this. There should be a person who is respected, there should be and his son is probably more respected. Do you think it's that one? And there is something like this in South Korea. There was a president father, and then there was a president daughter, right?
Yeah, that's right. Although in the case of South Korea, I mean, she won a legitimate election that was fairly held. It's just that, yes, you are right that she
But somehow
is a
she got to
daughter
this
of.
election and she got connections from his father. She still used it. And people were
Sure.
considering it normal. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So of course, one can argue all the other, invisible political influences and privileges that she may have enjoyed, but at least she did win the election. But I mean, going back to the current political structure in DPRK, I mean, it's hardly democratic, and we just don't know what kind of socialist state DPRK might have or could have achieved if the people had freely chosen. I think it's fair to say that that's a question
Yes,
that we don't
that's a
know.
very good question.
And that's a difficult question to answer when a political system, as you know, is operating in this tiny island in the ocean of the much more dominant structure,
Yep,
right? It's sort of an unfair thought experiment
Yep.
to say what different trajectory would it have taken if they hadn't been cornered and sandwiched from all sides. Do you see
Yes,
what I mean?
yes.
So for that reason, even though I consider myself fairly, ignorant of what's actually going on in DPRK, I think that at a minimum we should be just very careful in
Estimating anything.
estimating
there,
and digesting this easily,
But-
available information about
Yeah.
DPRK.
A lot of people asking what is the COVID situation in North Korea. Do we have any information? How many people are immunized? Is China sharing?
That's a great question. I think from my understanding, there's not a lot of data on that.
Yeah, it will be weird if they will be. It will be curious situation if they
Mhm.
won't be immunized and it'll be like, and then they will be reuniting in 50 years. More and more immunization stuff will happen in North Korea or in all world, but
Mhm.
North Korea will be like in the past, when America was with all these tribes and with all these people and they were not immunized from smallpox, and when they will unite, something can blow up. That could be curious situation.
They will be curious, and they will be curiously bad. I hope that doesn't happen. But two things I wanted to mention. Well, first, like many countries around the world, North Korea doesn't have access to COVID vaccines. I mean, South Korea only recently started having access to COVID vaccines, which is why the current COVID immunization coverage rate in South Korea, with its very robust health system, is still under 30%.
Yep,
And that's not because South Koreans are avoiding, it's just because of limited access. So North Korea, I mean, they don't have access to COVID vaccines, but what I find very encouraging is based on their other immunization programs as part of their routine immunization, based on annual reports from like UNICEF or Gavi, the coverage rate is high, I believe above 90% for a lot of the childhood vaccines. So what that tells me is, at least, despite the lack of access to latest knowledge, latest technology, latest medicines, they do have a robust, highly centralized public health system.
Yep.
So
In North Korea.
in North Korea,
Yeah.
so whatever they do have, so far, they are able to deliver them.
Yeah, it's the same as Cuba. Yeah.
That's right. Although I have to mention a caveat with that. There have been multiple reports to suggest that there's an increasing health inequities and economic inequalities even within the North Korean society because of the informal market activities. There is some
Black
private market activity, that's right. But going back to COVID, one thing that I find very cautiously exciting is that the South Korean government has at least announced an intent and an interest in cooperating with the North Korean government to support COVID vaccination on the Korean Peninsula. And I know those are just words, and it's such a huge distance between what's spoken as words versus what actually gets implemented as a policy. But that would be not only welcome, but that would be absolutely necessary for the Korean Peninsula to contain the COVID pandemic.
Since we were talking about North Korean healthcare a lot, let's talk about South Korean healthcare then. What do you think about it? And I know that South Korean healthcare showed itself as very sustainable and stable and pretty good and effective, because COVID-19 wasn't so bad in South Korea as it was in the US, for example. Yeah.
Yes, so yes, indeed, South Korean government and South Korea in general, including the citizens, they have responded effectively against COVID, and a number of factors have been highlighted as the main reasons why the success was achieved, and this also includes my own recent publication. So first of all, Korea does have universal healthcare system that's publicly funded, but provided by mainly private hospitals, but single payer system and publicly funded. But the actual provision of health services is done by largely private hospitals. So that is one big aspect that served the South Korean COVID response really well. But the other aspect that's important is after the MERS outbreak, South Korean government made a significantly increased investment in strengthening public health system.
Okay.
So that meant
by nationalizing it or by funding it?
So we already had the Korean CDC, which was a national infectious disease prevention and control agency, much like the US CDC, except that it wasn't receiving adequate funding to have enough personnel and to have effective coordinating mechanisms across, not just at the national level, but between the national level and subnational governments. So at the end of during and at the end of the MERS outbreak, South Korean government made significant investments to expand the mandate of the Korea CDC, as well as hiring more personnel and establishing a protocol to connect both the national government and the subnational governments at the district level, at the provincial level, at the city level. And to have those mechanisms in place, that was also critical to activate, because you already have sort of a response system to activate.
Yeah,
Whereas I believe in many places, including the US, the public health system, when COVID hit, had been completely emaciated. I mean, the public investment had been stripped off, right? And it's good to see that investment hopefully now returning to the public health system. But I think those two pieces were huge.
You said private hospitals are involved, but then why these private hospitals as a monopolies do not make it more expensive, make it like...
Because the government has the control over the private hospitals.
Okay.
That's right.
So they're like semi-private then.
That's right, and that I would say, in my opinion, might be a little bit contentious depending on who you ask. So some people might complain that the government exerts too much control over, what should be strictly private properties. But during a pandemic response, I mean, the Korean government did step up and actually exerted that control. So for example, over manufacturing essential goods like masks, of course, the actual manufacturers were private companies. But during this time, government exerted control over them to ensure the public safety. And more importantly, a lot of those policy decisions were widely supported by the South Korean citizens, which made it democratic. So it's not as if that the South Korean government sort of forced down policies that the citizens protested against. So what was really wonderful to observe as a non-Korean citizen, but like a Korean Canadian, was on one hand, there was suddenly an increased public control over what was largely considered as private assets.
Yes.
And this was democratically and actively deliberated within the public sphere. It's not like something that the government did behind people's back. It was known, and people responded well It's just that and we see this in many other countries around the world, as that social restrictions prolonged, people just became fatigued.
Yeah.
So they became antsy about how much longer do we have to do this, and exacerbating that problem even further, unlike US, Korea had, as I've mentioned, limited access to vaccines.
Yeah.
So the prolonged social restrictions continued until recently, when finally we had access to vaccines, and now vaccines are being rolled out. So I would say the public investments in primary health care, and especially the public health system,
Yep.
I think they played a huge role, and the fact that that was done in an active engagement with the civil societies and the population at large, not like somebody making a decision in the national government and just forcing people to obey.
It sounds like South Korean understood how bad can be epidemic with MERS, and
That is correct. That's right.
And
some painful lesson.
they don't want their people to die.
Right.
That's
right.
They will have nothing to rule. Their economy will fail. That's why this huge funds are put in this.
That's right. That's
Healthcare,
right.
yeah.
That's right. And at the end of that MERS outbreak, there was such a widespread public uproar against the government's poor handling of the outbreak at the time.
Just like now in the U.S.
That's right.
COVID,
That's
yeah.
right. And at that time, the poor handling of the MERS outbreak, plus a few other scandals, essentially led the Korean population to impeach the president at the time.
Let's talk about impeachments more. As for politics, I've read history of South Korea, and every other president either was went down because of his protests, or someone else took his place by force, or one of them was assassinated, I think, also.
Yes.
Yeah, and why is this like that? Why it's so unstable? I think the least safest profession in the world is the president of South Korea,
Okay, that's one way to look at it. Yeah, so if we think about the brief history of South Korean democracy, I mean, our first election, South Korea gained independence from Japan in 1945, right? Until then, we were ruled by our dynasty and then the Imperial Japan. So the history of democracy is short, and as I think you mentioned earlier on, we've had, at the beginning of its modern history, we've had a series of right-wing dictatorships that essentially seized power through military junta.
Yep.
So when we think about the series of assassination and a series of military coup, and that should be interpreted as, in my personal opinion, just part of the learning process of a democratic institution.
Yeah.
And the impeachment of the most recent president, the one who oversaw the response to the MERS outbreak,
Yep.
that I believe was really, that occurred through popular uprising. We call it candle uprising. So there was a widespread discontent among citizens over a number of issues, not just the MERS outbreak, but a number of other issues.
For me, I'm always critical about these public uprisings, honestly saying, because everywhere in the world, for example, let's take Ukraine. There was a public uprising there, and every time public uprising brings down anti-Western guy, and he brings the Western guy, people who are strongly for Europe, for consolidation with Europe, having the same economy, going to European Union, they always come to this public uprising. And then we find some tales that America strongly influence on this public, they send their people from embassy, they have their own connection, and this public uprising, it's not really public, it's like actors were leading people, for this public uprising. And when I hear about the South Korean president going down, For me, I don't know. I always think maybe it's the same thing happening, you know? Maybe this president was not very good with the West, with America, or he was doing too many stuff by himself. Yeah.
Oh no, this is an interesting question. I never thought of it that way because the Korean history, I mean, you're absolutely right. That kind of general tendency of quote unquote popular uprising being in fact,
Yes.
driven and controlled and influenced by um, certain interest groups, mostly like in the U.S. and the U.S. foreign the political elites. But in the case of Korea, because the country started out with a very much pro-U.S. right-wing dictatorships, in Korea, public uprising was the force to really bring down these US-backed regimes into a more democratic one. That distinction is an important one to keep in mind. At least using your example of what happened in Ukraine, I think in the Korean situation it's a little bit different that way.
Okay.
So even that most recently impeached President Park Geun-hye, the daughter of a former right-wing dictator, she and her policies were very much aligned with the U.S. foreign policy and very hostile to DPRK, for example.
Why she didn't send an army against the crowds?
Good question.
And in my opinion, you can pressure any public uprising if the West approves it, you know? For me, it's like that. And
I see.
why she didn't just send an army against these people and that's it?
That's right. And like many things that happen in history, it's we can always just make conjectures about
especially
why
such a
she
recent
didn't do
event.
this.
Yeah.
That's right. But again, in my personal observation, I think it's because Korean society and the democracy, Korean democratic institutions are now at a stage where that simply wasn't a practical option. So that militaristic suppression of protests was done so often throughout the Korean history, especially by the series of right-wing dictators. Now, I don't think something like that would work.
Really?
That would be my guess. Simply because of
public uprising wouldn't work, or pressing
suppressing the public uprising with the military force.
Yeah, not gonna work.
I think, and I say this with a hint of pride, I think the South Korean society has matured beyond that point, beyond the point of tolerating it or being simply silenced or suppressed by that.
And you said that there is a tendency of liberalization, of like South Korean government seem to be more relaxed, you know? They're not so strongly
because people are stronger.
No, yeah.
People are much stronger now than I think before.
I don't know. People are formed by the policies. It's not like it's a good question. What is the source of it? Yeah. But what I wanted to ask you, as we know, it's not so scary to be a Marxist in South Korea now as in 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, and right now it's probably less of a risk to be openly a socialist or a communist or a Marxist. Again, I say this carefully because I've never really worked in Korea. So the environment is probably much more permissive to different thoughts. However, I would say that carefully. I mean, having a permissive environment, what does that really mean, right? Because there are many ways of being permissive.
Yep.
Is it permissive enough if you've described your thoughts that are very Marxian in character and you didn't get tortured and killed?
Yep.
Right? Or are you able to now express those thoughts, but you are completely marginalized, that it doesn't matter anyways? So I'm actually not so sure.
Two ways of suppressing it here. One is to arrest and one just to hide it, like.
That's right, or completely just marginalizing it. So it doesn't matter. I mean, you can say all you want over here in this, predefined corner where you don't matter. So that's actually a question that I ask myself. I don't know to what extent South Korean society has become truly permissive to different ideas.
Well,
That I don't
we
know.
can
But
watch it and see, and
Mhm.
especially watch movies, right? We
Mhm.
can see a culture changing. So I have watched Parasite,
Mhm.
and this director, he's a Marxist, and he's not afraid to say that, right? He's
Has he
providing.
ever publicly called himself Marxian or Marxist? I don't
think-
believe so.
Really?
But I
Okay.
could be wrong, but
Okay.
I don't recall him doing so. But what is, you are raising an interesting
But
point.
he's still asking class questions. and
Exactly.
It's
Absolutely.
clearly can be seen who is Parasite in this movie. That's a deep question.
That's right.
These guys who are sitting in their houses, parasites, or these millionaires are parasites. That's a good
There's
question,
definitely, even though I don't know whether he formally interpreted it that way, but I've also interpreted it as there's just so much class analysis all over it,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
even I would say like a Marxian, like materialist.
I'm not sure
angle
if he
there.
called himself Marxist, but for sure he said something about classes, about society.
Social class, yes, that's right.
Yep.
So I think now I'm aware of one organization that I just found out from my Google search accidentally, but there are many other civil society organizations in South Korea that are very much informed of what I would call Marxian class analysis,
Yeah,
but they
yeah,
may
yeah.
not say so. There's a wonderful health organization called People's Health Movement, which is a
Yeah.
global entity, and
Yep,
it
yep.
has a chapter in Korea. Same thing, they don't describe themselves as like a Marxian this or Marxist that, but if you actually read their activities, there's a lot of attention paid to class relations and class interests,
Yep,
and
yep,
how those aspects are so critical in not just understanding but solving health inequities.
Yep.
And you see somewhat similar trend in wanting to look at like labor relations. Again, you don't see that many organizations that come out with a flag saying, hey, we are a Marxist organization, but their stance and their values have been, as far as I can tell, deeply inspired by, or at least informed by, like Marxian theories. So there's a lot of potential cultural shift that way, I would say, which I find very energizing. And now, which direction this is going to continue forward, I'm very curious to see. But things are not as
Good.
rosy as I would perhaps hope. Like, for example, so I would say that I'm cautiously optimistic, but I do emphasize cautiously because, like, for example, the other day I was listening to the Korean news that they're going to introduce the 52-hour work week.
Wow.
I know, exactly. And even that
where's
met
people uprising?
and that's right. And that met huge resistance from a lot of businesses. They thought this is going to harm small and medium-sized businesses.
Why?
Because
It's like breaking all stereotypes, you know?
their entire business models were based on long working hours.
Oh, I thought you were talking about going from 40-hour week to 52-hour week.
No.
Okay.
Improving working conditions
Okay.
to 52-hour, which is, but
and then
your
how much-
misunderstanding
how
is
many
completely
hou-
understandable.
How many hours is it
The
now?
average-
80 hours
Oh,
week?
I don't
Or it's like
know.
there is no limit at all?
Right now, I don't know what the current average is, but I know that South Korea is one of the OECD nations with the longest working hours. So, which is why there was a huge support from certain progressive organizations to push the government to reduce it to 52-hour week. So you can look at it in two ways, right? On one hand, you could say that, oh my God, I mean, you have to keep going much further down. I mean, 52 is not good enough. So in that sense, Korea certainly has a long way to go in improving labor relations. But at the same time, at least it's pushing in the right direction.
Yeah, I would also note that they could, if they would, if the government would be smarter, if this businessmen would be smarter, probably they would do the same as they did in the U.S. Formally, we have full 40-hour week, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't work as software engineer. Sometimes I work 60, sometimes I work 80, and my salary is annual. They don't care how many hours you work, and this is like a backdoor for the law, you know. So I don't know. Even these rules are
how it's actually how it's actually implemented.
Yeah.
And also, this relates to another reason why I say I'm cautiously optimistic. It's things are not all that rosy. I mean, yes, there are some, in my opinion, reasons to be optimistic and to push things forward. But on one hand, it opens up for this backdoor phenomena, like expanding informal economy. That's already been reported in papers. Also, there's been an increase in migrant workers that work in South Korea, and I fear, and I do believe that this is likely to be one of the biggest public health equity challenges that South Korea has to confront. That this emerging class divide, not so much among Koreans anymore, because the economic inequalities among South Koreans used to be much worse, and that steadily improved, which is great. But now, with this increasing number of foreign migrant workers residing in Korea, taking up on jobs that South Koreans don't want to do themselves, or too dangerous, or through these informal economy where there's this backdoor opportunity for, and that puts these migrant workers in a very vulnerable position.
Some of these
vulnerable
workers
to
are
exploitation.
illegal immigrant workers. I have several friends who is in South Korea and they're working there, and they came over for tourist visa just to make money for a couple of years and then go back.
That's
and
right.
These people are the most lawless, you know. You can just call police and that's it. They'll be gone from the country, so you don't have to pay them salary every time. You
That's
know?
right. So they're truly exposed to multiple conditions of exploitation.
The worst thing, they can't protest. They can't say a word. You know.
That's right. So I fear, and I hope I get proven wrong, but I fear that this rising new class divide, I call it a new class divide, but maybe that's not the most accurate term, because Koreans are not used to seeing the Korean society as a multicultural society. This is sort of a relatively new phenomenon, that we have this new group of people who are foreigners that are taking up, that occupy lower class position than Koreans. I mean, that's a relatively new phenomenon. So unless there are some concrete programs and policies put in place to really expose the conditions of exploitation that these workers face,
but the government itself, I think the situation will not change, because the government is itself consists of this nationalist people who is like, South Korea is for South Koreans, and not for foreigners. You know, it's the same as in Japan. I think, there is special word for person who was born first generation in Japan. You know, it's like not like here.
That's my fear. That's my fear. I do share this concern. I really hope that Korea doesn't go that route.
Yep.
The route that so many other wealthy nations have walked, as you know, right? And including U.S. And
I think it's a law, and that's how capitalism works.
That's right. That's exactly how capitalist structure works. It concentrates resources.
Yep.
And in my view, it fractures the working class, because to many people, this rising new class, they may not see that as a class divide. They may think that no, because Koreans now we are much more equal to each other. Why are you now paying attention to this other group of people? Right?
That's
you know,
right,
we've got it made. We've improved economic inequalities. But if you actually think think of some of the most marginalized Koreans and sort of reflect on their material conditions
Like
and
in
how
Parasite.
that's right, and how those material conditions relate to their chances in life and their life trajectories, then those migrant workers and these most marginalized Koreans actually have a lot more to share. So I would love to see them recognize that shared interests and push their agenda together. And there are some signs that that's happening more now than before. It's still very precious few, which is why I say
Cautious optimism.
cautiously optimistic. I want to be optimistic, but at the same time, I know that things are not so rosy.
Yep.
And I do feel such a sense of urgency about that particular issue. I really hope that South Korean working class
will unite with immigrants.
stands in solidarity with the migrant workers, and I believe that that is likely.
Unlikely.
Like what are the conditions that could make it a little bit more likely? And that is recognizing their shared interests. But these shared interests, especially when there's this race and ethnicity involved,
That's exactly right. Yeah.
as we see in the U.S.,
It's like
just gets forgotten.
I'll be working for $1,000 per month for 5 years in one place, then migrant worker comes over and starts working there for $500 per month.
Yeah.
And what should they feel to this migrant worker?
Yeah, that's
I
right.
think the opposite will happen. The nationalism will rise in South Korea, and South Koreans will be saying, let's kick out all these immigrants, not understanding the economical structure under it. Yeah.
That is my fear. And actually that is one aspect of what's going on in South Korea that I perhaps feel the greatest sense of urgency, both as a health researcher in looking at it as a health equity problem, because health equity is rooted in these inequity in material conditions.
You have very interesting history of your career. You have been here and there, and you have the strong South Korean background, and you've lived in Canada, and you lived in
Germany.
the US, in Germany, in so many places. And I thought you mentioned that you volunteered in Kenya.
That's right. I worked and lived in Kenya and Bangladesh briefly.
Yep. And you worked in the US, and the US is kind of popular in the world with their healthcare system, in the bad manner. What is the most shocking fact about healthcare for you?
Thank you for asking that question, because that's actually a question that I've thought so much about during the last 13 months. In my opinion, what was by far most shocking was how the level of sophisticated technology and knowledge about infectious disease, health, and the pandemic itself, they cannot compensate for weak public health system. That's my conclusion after observing how U.S. government has horribly mishandled the COVID response. Because as you know, U.S. is one of the wealthiest nations in the world, and in terms of the technical and intellectual prowess, like the knowledge they need to control infectious disease, U.S. is one of the leading nations, no doubt. Yeah. And yet, and not to mention so many life-saving interventions available in the country, right? So a lot of products, healthcare products that are available. But how do they exist? They all exist in this massively privatized system. So for me, such a clear lesson from observing what has been happening in the US is none of that technological or knowledge, the sophistication of the knowledge and technology or the healthcare products can substitute for solid public investment in something foundational like public health system, primary health care that is publicly owned and controlled. So if you just leave it up to the market, this is what happens. And in my opinion, this is completely predictable. And I really hope that this system reflects on the lessons learned and improve.
Do you really believe that? I think it's. I don't see any other way of this happening rather than uh, revolution, because corporations are holding their hands, and corporation is holding our government.
Yeah.
And we can't just say we will make healthcare universal. This president, he will be such an under crazy pressure, you know, if he'll be doing that. Yeah. Um, so I think it's not possible to reform this system.
You mean the U.S. system?
Yeah, the American system, because corporation is holding everything. Yeah.
The sheer degree to which the wealth and power are concentrated in the U.S. society, to me, is daunting. So when I see that, it does make it difficult for me to be very optimistic about what's going to happen. Just because of the sheer power that's concentrated in corporations, and once there's such extreme concentration of power, it just contaminates all the other political processes and even the consciousness of ordinary people whose lives are adversely affected by these policies, right? I mean, for the public to rise, they need to recognize the conditions that lead to their marginalization and deprivation. And when that concentrated power dominates over the public for so long, it really influences the public minds and limits the public's ability to protest and change it.
People are, after this COVID-19 stuff, catastrophe happened in the US, people started actually asking, hey, why don't we make it as in Canada? And people were posting it on the Reddit, you know, or on some forums. And people, and I thought, wow, this person is asking very, very good question, and people were liking him. But when you open it and go there, you see the most liked comment is, hey, I'm from Canada and we have lines everywhere. We have to wait for important operation. We have queues. We have everything is very slow, and the quality of healthcare is lower than in Canada, is lower than in America. And this person, he sounds convincing, you know, like it's.
I've heard those
They're
comments.
both are bad, you know, but the American has their own like prerogatives.
I mean, as a Canadian citizen, I do say that yes, it's not a perfect system, but I would still say that it is a publicly funded universal health care. You don't have to be rich to access essential health services in Canada, and that's something to be proud of. I take great pride in that. Now, the common criticisms that I've heard against the Canadian system are the waits too long and diagnosis of critical diseases. Sometimes they miss too much, too often, because they're too careful and cautious not to recommend a certain treatments, because they have to consider that this is not these kind of services are not reserved for the privileged few. This is really, services have to be there, made available for every Canadian, right? So for that reason, I think there is a trade-off. Those are the comments that I've heard most often. But if you look at the data of the overall health status between Canadian population and American population, on the whole, Canadian population, they're not suffering from poor health conditions at all. Like the health equity is better on the whole. Canada does show health inequities in its own way. So for example, the Indigenous communities across Canada, they are the ones that represent the most marginalized communities, often showing the worst health outcomes. So I'm not saying that Canada is a perfect example where health inequity does not exist. Of course, it does exist, and it must be improved. So I'm not making excuses for those inequities. But again, going back to some of the common criticisms against the Canadian system compared to the US system, on equity, I mean, the Canadian system has served health equity much better.
How come
than the
Indigenous
US.
people are the least the most marginalized. I think I thought they're carrying them on hands. You know, like there's so many, so much money and so much funds are for them, devoted for them.
Programs and policies to improve the health of a marginalized community. It's not just as simple as just providing more services, right? Again, we have to go back to what those health problems are rooted in, like these living conditions and the working conditions, not to mention the long history of structural like violence committed against the community.
Yes, yes.
So without addressing those underlying roots, simply making available more diagnostic tests or treatments, it's not enough. So even though I by no means hold any expert knowledge on the Canadian Indigenous communities, we need to go deeper. It's not enough that we make more funding available just to improve access to certain health services. We need to go deeper so that the communities and the historic injustice that they've suffered, and what do we mean by that? That means that their entire value system was deemed inferior to the dominant view, right? That's to make it really specific. And to sort of address that level of structural injustice, just access to access to services is not going to be enough.
Well, let's come back to this forum, to this Reddit topic.
Yes, I would love to.
And then this liberal, he says, you said that it's equal to poor and rich, and he will respond, it's equally bad for everyone. And here in America, you can have a good if you deserved it, if you worked hard enough to make money, you know.
Oh, wow. Yes, I've heard that line too. I strongly disagree, because if you're rich, you are able to access some highly fancy experimental medicines in the US that you may not be able to access in Canada. That is true. But I mean, that comes at the cost of like leaving behind marginalized communities, just having a much poorer access. The way this person describes it, that at least in US, these good services, high quality services, you can access if you deserve it, right? That narrative of meritocracy, if you deserve it. I think that is one myth that is important to debunk. Because I think for far too long in the US, this narrative of meritocracy has been used to legitimize economic inequalities, that if you've worked hard, so obviously if you're rich, and if you're really good at being rich, surely you must deserve it. You must have really worked extra hard, or maybe you are brilliant in whatever you do. But I mean, as you know, whatever we do, it's impossible to imagine that we can gain whatever knowledge I have, be it immunology or software engineering, without public services, without using like public education or other knowledge that was generated through public education. So I find it almost impossible to justify claims like that purely based on some individual merits alone. Like I cannot imagine that, well, I'm super rich because I'm a brilliant immunologist or I'm a brilliant software engineer, but how did you actually accumulate your knowledge? And I cannot imagine an argument that you can accumulate the degree of knowledge and skills without public education and other public services that have supported the environment in which you were able to pursue those things. So this private merit argument, I don't find compelling at all. But that's a very common one. You're right.
Yep. We started with universal healthcare. We talked about America. We talked about Canada. But somehow we pulled this thread, and then we came to the analysis of society. It's like it shows how everything is interconnected. Healthcare is connected to economy. People conversation is connected to economy. Everything is about how economy was built, you know. And everything else is depending on this economy. They're influencing on each other. And this is a deeply Marxist thought for me, you know. Although I noticed that you are very careful with the term Marxism, you're like, you are saying Marxian analysis, but you're like avoiding this term. You don't call yourself Marxist, as I understand.
I appreciate that you noted that. That's right. I am very intentionally careful about using the term Marxist, mainly because I think it sometimes has the risk of just distracting our conversation. But you are right. I think even though, as I was just doing my research to better understand the root causes of health inequities, I was almost drawn to Marxian theories, like despite my almost like effort not to fall into some dogmatic ideas, or at least so I thought. And I do believe that there are several aspects of the Marx thoughts that are not only relevant to the health inequity problems that we see right now globally, but I almost see a sense of urgency in utilizing that framework more usefully and widely. Again, if we look at health inequities at the most superficial level, we can just look at it as a biological phenomenon. But at the population level, why certain communities consistently have shown a significantly greater susceptibility to a set of infectious disease and conditions of ill health, like for example indigenous communities both in the US and in Canada, and Latinx as well as African Americans in the US, right? This is not a new thing, as you know. And the lens of the materialist analysis, specifically the lens of looking at material interests, like which individuals, which social groups share greater material interests, and what does it mean if we actually look at social groups that actually have antagonistic material relations or material interests. How does that antagonism manifest itself? Who's going to benefit from specific policies? And who's going to be left out of specific policies? So this is how I became more and more drawn to reading about Marxian class analysis.
But you're still skeptical about the word Marxist, the term Marxist, right?
That's right. And maybe that's just something that I need to reflect more on. What makes it difficult for me to call myself Marxist? Maybe part of it is that as a scientist, I favor maintaining a certain distance from a set of thoughts without being married to it. It's extremely important for me to always remind myself that there is and there will never be something inherently emancipatory.
Yep.
So no matter what it is, it's Marxist or whatever, whether it's feminist discourse or anti-racist discourse, I think there is a danger in seeking a narrative that is totalizing, that they can give us answers as if it's sort of a universal truth. So I think in general,
as a religion, right?
That's right. That's right. Turning something into religion, like sacralizing something, and I think for that reason, maybe the reason why I feel a lot more comfortable stating that I find specific Marxian theories compelling. I find that a lot more comfortable because then there I see sort of a certain distance between myself and the ideas. It's not like I take that as a set of God's words that I must kind of follow and fall into. But going back to the relevance of Marxian values to health inequities, let me try and think of sort of a concrete and immediate example, like vaccine inequity. Globally, people have recognized the spectacular vaccine inequities in access to COVID vaccines. Essentially, the countries who have the manufacturers to make COVID vaccines, they have access, and the countries that do not have it, they have to wait until the excess doses get donated. So a lot of the governments and international agencies gathered together to donate excess doses. There was a lot of calls made publicly advocating for more donation of vaccines. And there was also a campaign to support building vaccine manufacturing capacities in low and middle income countries.
Yep, that's a good example, yeah.
And now here, I have two thoughts. On one hand, those are great. Those are great steps for an immediate step, because right now too many people are still dying despite the fact that we have this proven intervention. So I would agree that yes, let's continue to push for that, for more donation of doses and supporting local vaccine production capacity. Good. Now, what is missing in that debate that I feel a sense of urgency in conveying is whenever we talk about availability or access to resources, access to something or availability of something, that is only one side of the equation. Because ultimately, I think the question that we need to ask, in addition to access, is who ultimately controls and owns the production itself. So I will make it even more concrete, again, using this COVID vaccine. So let's imagine that indeed we have additional resources made available, and now there are vaccine making factories built up in multiple countries in South Asia, multiple countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. Good. But unless we start paying attention to ultimately who actually owns and controls those production capacity, then again, we will go right back into the same question of inequities, in my view. Why?
Yeah.
Because, again, as a thought exercise, let's imagine that 5 years down the road, 3 years down the road, that we have an X number of additional pandemic vaccine manufacturing capability in Sub-Saharan Africa. But if the ultimate ownership and control reside with the G7 or the US government and Pfizer, Moderna, and a group of high-income country vaccine manufacturers, then essentially those sites, whether it's Ghana or South Africa or Kenya, whatever it may be, they will merely serve as just a site to provide those vaccines. So I know that right now these are all conjectures. We actually don't know which way it's going to go. But where I sense urgency is right now so much of the well-intentioned debates focus so much on just the distribution side of vaccines, like availability. Let's make this availability. Rich countries donate more. Funders invest more in building up these factories. But not enough attention, in my opinion, is paid to that. Okay, let's move forward a little bit. Imagine further ahead. If we were to have additional sites, who will actually make the decisions about what vaccines will be produced, where, how many?
The owners.
Yeah, the actual ownership and control issue.
Yep.
And in the health, especially in the global health field, that question around control and ownership is so marginalized. Why? Because, as you know, that touches on, it's a question of power, and it's a question of relations of power.
Relations
And
of owners.
That's right. It is about relations of ownership and control. It is about relations of power. And much of the discourse in my field in health and health equity, despite the good intentions that they express, unless we make this power visible, we are merely perpetuating the same unequal relations of power and health inequities, is my prediction.
You sound
So-
like you. It sounds like you're a communist. You talked about that system cannot be reformed, but it should be revolutionized somehow. You talked about the question of owners, who owns the means of production.
That's right. I think the question of ownership is an important one. I mean, labels, I don't care so much.
Okay.
But actually, so my most recent manuscript that just got accepted talks about exactly this, how in order to solve vaccine inequities, we simply cannot just be stuck in this distribution side of the equation. We really need to address this ownership and control and relations of power. But it got accepted, and which itself is a hopeful sign, because I think anytime you touch
I
upon
think nobody
power,
understood it. That's why they're just, oh, she.
that might be
Yeah.
that's actually
We talked a lot
real
about
possibility.
donations, about philanthropy,
Mhm.
how rich people are helping to poor, and
Mhm.
in health industry, it's a big thing. You know, people
Mhm.
are constantly talking like, "Hey, we should." Some billionaire donated $100 million to some country to build clinics there or something, but I don't know. I don't think it's working for some reason. What do you think about it? It's effective solution of the problem. Maybe rich will just share their money and then we'll be living fine. Everything will be good. No revolution needed.
I don't think charity will solve health inequities. I think there are two aspects that I feel very strongly about. One is related to, again, the need and necessity to consider the root causes. Charity, in my view, implicitly serves the function of obscuring the root causes. What that then masks are the very reasons why those communities are marginalized in the society in the first place. I mean, even if we think about the word marginalization itself, a deprivation within a society is a necessary consequence of extreme concentration of resources and power in a different corner of the society. So I'm very concerned with the narrative in my field that health equity is framed as something that the wealthy and the privileged should do out of goodness of their heart, out of a sense of moral duty, or maybe even a responsibility to protect the vulnerable. That's often the framing of it.
That's ugly
that
term.
It is indeed an ugly term, and it, in my view, extremely pernicious because it kind of hides the root causes and it smooths the machinery to keep on going. That's what I find really ugly about it. So when we look at a society where there is a persistent deprivation of wealth and good health, the reaction, in my view, for the privileged and wealthy is, oh, we should be charitable. We should feel responsible to do our own bit. But instead of that, I think there is far more emancipatory potential if the privileged recognize that my privileged position is a necessary condition for that deprivation to occur. These are relational things. It's not like, oh, I just happen to be very successful in gathering this knowledge and wealth, and you just happen to be very unfortunate. No.
There is a Russian saying like, people are poor because some people are very rich. Yeah.
That's right. This has to be deprivation of resources and health has to be looked at in relational terms, not at the individual level or just at the community level, as if that something terrible has just happened to this community through some mysterious force of nature. It's not like that, right?
Yeah.
So
like there is a class of exploitators and exploited. Yeah.
That's right. And you have to look at the system that is built on, and it requires concentrating resources. So in a way, this marginalizing and depriving specific communities of resources and power, this is not an accident at all. This is a predictable and necessary consequence of the system that is contingent on concentrating wealth. Do you see what I mean? So there's an inherent contradiction.
Yeah.
So I would love to see soberly acknowledging that inherent contradiction rather than framing it as charity and moral duty or responsibility. And on that front, we do have quite a way to go in my field.
Since you exist in a cultural world that is pretty far from me, honestly saying, I haven't watched a lot of Korean movies except Parasite and My Path. Actually, I wanted to talk about it, but it's okay already. Yeah, and what movies would you recommend to watch to understand South Korea more? What books to read, maybe?
I have a movie that I would love to recommend to all viewers of this video.
Sure, sure.
It's an old Korean movie. It's called, the Korean title is 서편제. And the 서편제 refers to this genre of vocal music, traditional Korean vocal music that is, it came out a while back, but it's such a, in my view, still the best, one of the best Korean films that touch on this emotion known as Han. It's difficult to describe in English, but I would say it's sort of the state of having overcome suffering. So the state where you've transcended suffering and sorrow. But transcending it doesn't mean denying it. It's like you've gone beyond confronting it, you've dealt with it, you've owned it, and then you've risen above it. And it's the Han is that like distilled residues of sorrow, if you will. And that movie touches upon that sentiment through the journey of this young musician who tries to master the art of 서편제. Yep. And it was shot entirely in my home province, so I have a little bit of a bias.
What about books that introduced you to Marxian analysis?
The early entry, I deeply owe two individuals that one I've met, and my mentor, Carles Montana, is a professor at the University of Toronto. He was born and raised in Catalonia. So when I was doing my second master's degree in public health, I attended his course on employment condition as a determinant of health. And it fascinated me. And so I looked him up to learn about his previous research, and I just immediately got into like his the way he was analyzing determinants of health, not just in the biological realm, but labor relations. Specifically using South Korean examples from the 60s and the 70s when labor was horribly exploited in South Korea. So that's my first entry. And then through Carles, I was introduced to this wonderful body of scholarship by American sociologist Eric Olin Wright. He passed away a couple of years ago. And he's the one that his work was really what initiated me into the Marxian class analysis.
Interesting.
The impact it had on me, just the way I was asking questions around health inequities, just changed since then, since I was introduced. So the very first book by Eric Olin Wright I read while I was taking the class by Carles was Class Counts. That was my very first book on class analysis, and it was one of those books that you just immediately get absorbed because you find it so compelling, the explanatory power it has in explaining so many observations that I had struggled with at the time. Okay. So yeah, that was my initial. So I only started reading Marx only recently. I spent far more time reading about Eric Olin Wright's writings and Carles' writings. And I think my mentor Carles once jokingly said that Eric Olin Wright is more lucid than Marx, so it's probably a good thing that you start with, right? So I thought, okay, well, I'll do that. And only after I read a few books by Eric Olin Wright, and then I became curious to see what Marx actually said. So that's how I
really hope your research workers will also create more Marxists.
That would be such an honor if I can like inspire or encourage any young mind to just to ask the questions about health inequities slightly differently. I would feel so honored to have a small part in that intellectual journey.
Yep, write a book.
I
Okay,
should someday.
okay. Some fireball words to our viewers from post-Soviet Union countries, Russian-speaking people.
I would, I think maybe one thing that I would share is, for me, again, Marx's very first question, what drew you into Marxian theories? And looking back at my own journey, I am so thankful that I almost stumbled upon it. It's not like I set out on a quest to learn about Marx theories, never. And in retrospect, I think that has served me well. My journey of inquiries, it has served it really well, because I had a series of questions that I was so eager to answer. And some might say that, wow, it just took you a really long time. But I think I benefited hugely from just reflecting on my own questions themselves and how they arose. So, whoever is watching this video and whatever their journey is, perhaps that's something that they can think about.
I'll sum it up: study Marxism.